In the bustling terminal of Heathrow Airport, passengers hurried to their gates, eager to embark on their journeys. Among them was Jonathan Reed, a distinguished black man in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored navy suit that spoke of understated elegance. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, his presence commanding respect. As Jonathan approached the boarding area for his flight to New York, he noticed a commotion near the gate. A woman in her mid-50s, with meticulously styled blonde hair and an air of self-importance, was arguing with the gate attendant. Her voice, sharp and insistent, carried over the ambient noise of the terminal. "I demand an upgrade to first class," she declared, her tone brooking no argument. "I've been a loyal customer for years, and I will not be relegated to coach." The gate attendant, maintaining a professional demeanor, replied, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but all first-class seats are currently occupied. We can place you on the upgrade list, but we cannot guarantee a seat." The woman's eyes narrowed as she scanned the first-class passengers waiting to board. Her gaze settled on Jonathan, who was engrossed in a business report on his tablet. A look of disdain crossed her face, and she marched over to him, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Excuse me," she said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "I believe there's been a mistake. This section is for first-class passengers only." Jonathan looked up, his expression calm but questioning. "I'm aware, ma'am," he replied evenly. She pursed her lips, her eyes flicking over him with thinly veiled contempt. "Then you must understand that this area is reserved for those who have paid for the privilege. Perhaps you're in the wrong place." Before Jonathan could respond, the gate attendant approached, sensing the escalating tension. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between the two. The woman turned to the attendant, her voice dripping with indignation. "Yes, there is. This man is occupying a seat in first class, and I highly doubt he belongs here. I insist you check his ticket." A hush fell over the surrounding passengers, all eyes now on the unfolding scene. Jonathan remained composed, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve his boarding pass. He handed it to the attendant, who examined it briefly before returning it with a respectful nod. "Mr. Reed is indeed a first-class passenger," she confirmed, her tone leaving no room for doubt. The woman's face flushed with embarrassment, but she quickly masked it with a haughty tilt of her chin. "Well, I still believe there's been an oversight. I demand to speak with a supervisor." At that moment, a tall man in a crisp uniform approached, his demeanor authoritative yet approachable. "Is there an issue here?" he inquired, his gaze encompassing both Jonathan and the woman. The woman turned to him, her expression triumphant. "Yes, there is. This man is occupying a first-class seat, and I don't believe he has the right to be here. I insist he be removed from the flight." The supervisor raised an eyebrow, his eyes flicking to Jonathan, who met his gaze steadily. "Ma'am, I assure you, Mr. Reed has every right to his seat. In fact," he added, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "Mr. Reed is the owner of this airline." A stunned silence followed his words. The woman's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her face paling as the realization sank in. Jonathan remained calm, his expression inscrutable. The supervisor turned to Jonathan, his demeanor respectful. "Mr. Reed, I apologize for any inconvenience. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your journey more comfortable." Jonathan inclined his head slightly. "Thank you. I trust the matter is resolved." The woman, now visibly shaken, stammered, I didn't know. I didn't realize." Jonathan met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Perhaps next time, you might consider addressing your concerns with a bit more courtesy," he said quietly. With that, he returned to his seat, leaving the woman standing there, her face a portrait of mortification. The surrounding passengers, who had been silent spectators, exchanged glances, the tension slowly dissipating. As the boarding process continued, Jonathan couldn't help but reflect on the encounter. It was a stark reminder of the prejudices that still pervaded society, even in the most unexpected places, but it also reaffirmed his commitment to fostering inclusivity and respect within his airline, a mission that had driven him from the very beginning. Settling into his seat, Jonathan glanced out the window at the bustling tarmac below. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and he was determined to be a catalyst for that change, one flight at a time. As the confrontation lingered, the blonde woman's face flushed with indignation, but she refused to back down. "I don't care what ticket he has," she snapped. "People like him always find a way to game the system. I won't sit here and be ignored." The murmurs around the gate grew louder. Some passengers shuffled uncomfortably, while others whispered to one another, their glances darting between the woman and Jonathan. Jonathan, sitting calm and collected, tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. He was accustomed to situations like this, moments when dignity was challenged by ignorance. But this time, there was something different. This time, it was personal. The airline supervisor, clearly uneasy, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I must ask you to lower your voice. There's no issue here." "Oh, there is an issue," the woman interrupted, pointing an accusatory finger at Jonathan. "I've flown first class for years, and I've never seen standards drop this low. I want him off this flight, or I'll have to call security myself." Jonathan exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. He stood up, not aggressively, but deliberately. At 6'2", his height immediately added weight to his presence. He looked her squarely in the eye, his deep baritone voice calm, yet cutting through the air like a blade. "Ma'am," he said, "perhaps you're mistaken about your understanding of the situation." The woman, taken aback by the quiet authority in his tone, sputtered, "What's that supposed to mean?" Jonathan glanced at the supervisor and gave a slight nod. "Please go ahead and call security, as she suggested. I would hate for any confusion to remain unresolved." The supervisor hesitated, but recognizing Jonathan's composed expression, radioed for airport security to intervene. The crowd tensed as the moment escalated. People filmed discreetly on their phones, sensing that something far bigger was unfolding. Jonathan returned to his seat, calmly picking up his tablet as though he were unconcerned. Minutes later, 2 uniformed airport security officers arrived. "We were told there's an incident," one officer said, looking at the supervisor for clarity. Before the supervisor could explain, the woman sprang forward. Yes, it's him," she said, jabbing a manicured finger toward Jonathan. "He doesn't belong here. I'm a loyal customer, and I will not share this flight with someone who has no business sitting in first class." The security officer turned toward Jonathan, who looked up, serene as ever. "Sir, may we see your boarding pass?" Jonathan handed it over without hesitation. The officer scanned it quickly, his brows lifting as he registered the passenger's name. "Mr. Reed," he said carefully, "this confirms you are in seat 1A. The blonde woman's face twisted in disbelief. "There must be a mistake," she cried. "Check again. There has to be a mistake." The security officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "there is no mistake. Mr. Jonathan Reed is not only a valid first-class passenger, but I recommend you treat him with the respect he deserves." "Why on earth should I do that?" she sneered. At this, Jonathan slowly set down his tablet, rising once more to his full height. The terminal had grown deadly quiet as passengers watched with bated breath. He smoothed his jacket and, for the first time, allowed his words to carry a deliberate edge. "Because, ma'am," he said, his gaze steady, "I own the airline." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The blonde woman froze as though she'd been struck. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her face drained of color as the realization began to set in. Jonathan continued, his tone firm but devoid of anger. "You called for security. You questioned my right to this seat. You judged me based on your assumptions, not facts. But here's a fact for you. My name is Jonathan Reed, and I'm the CEO of this airline." The woman swayed slightly, her confidence crumbling like a house of cards. The security officers exchanged looks, stepping back as if to distance themselves from her misstep. The supervisor, now visibly relieved, nodded in confirmation. "Mr. Reed is correct," he added. "He owns Reed Airlines." Whispers spread like wildfire through the terminal. "That's him?" someone murmured. "The CEO? No way." Phones were now held boldly in the air, capturing every humiliating detail of the moment. The woman looked at Jonathan, her face contorting with panic. I didn't know." "That much is clear," Jonathan replied coolly. "But the damage is done." Tears sprang to the woman's eyes as the weight of her actions sank in. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Jonathan studied her carefully, his gaze softening only slightly. It wasn't the first time he'd faced discrimination, nor would it be the last. But this time, he knew the lesson would be heard far beyond the walls of Heathrow. "I'm not here to embarrass you," he said finally, his tone quiet but firm. "I'm here to make sure you, and everyone else, understand something very simple. Respect is not determined by the color of someone's skin, nor the assumptions you make about them." The woman wiped at her cheeks, silent now as she absorbed the humiliation of her own making. Jonathan turned to the supervisor. "Is the flight ready to board?" "Yes, Mr. Reed," the supervisor said quickly. "We'll be boarding immediately." Jonathan nodded and looked back at the woman one last time. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." He turned and strode toward the gate, leaving her standing there, paralyzed in shame. As Jonathan entered the jet bridge, the crowd burst into a quiet, respectful applause, an acknowledgement of the dignity he'd displayed in the face of ugliness. The woman, now utterly ignored, sank into a nearby seat, stunned and defeated. For Jonathan, the incident was over, but for the passengers who had witnessed it, the lesson would remain long after the flight landed. The cabin of the plane hummed softly as passengers settled into their seats. Jonathan Reed sat in 1A, the premier first-class seat that offered the perfect blend of comfort and privacy. He removed his jacket, hanging it neatly before reclining into the plush leather seat. Outside, the gray London sky was now a distant memory as the engines prepared for takeoff. Though his expression remained calm, Jonathan's thoughts lingered on the incident at the gate. The woman's behavior had been disappointing, but not surprising. In his years as the CEO of Reed Airlines, and before that, as a young entrepreneur, he had encountered countless moments where prejudice attempted to undermine his accomplishments. Yet, he had learned long ago that dignity in the face of ignorance was its own quiet form of victory. He reached for his phone and scrolled through emails, but he couldn't ignore the whispers of conversation filtering from other first-class seats. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier commotion were still discussing it. "I can't believe that woman acted like that," a young man in seat 1C whispered to his seatmate. "Did you see his face? Calm as a rock. I'd have lost it." "I know," replied a woman across the aisle. "And he owns the airline? Unreal. That's what grace looks like." Jonathan's lips twitched in a faint smile as he listened, though he made no effort to interrupt. The crew began their safety demonstration, and the flight soon lifted off, ascending into the clouds. For Jonathan, the quiet of the cabin offered a moment to reflect, not on his own achievements, but on the roads he had walked to get here. 2 decades earlier, Jonathan Reed was the son of hard-working parents from a small neighborhood in Atlanta. His father, a mechanic, spent long days fixing cars to provide for his family, while his mother worked multiple jobs, cleaning houses during the day and waitressing at a diner by night. They had little money, but no shortage of ambition. From a young age, Jonathan had a mind for business. At 14, he started mowing lawns on weekends, using his father's old mower. By 16, he had hired 3 neighborhood kids to help him expand his lawn care business. He saved every dollar, not to spend on clothes or gadgets like his friends, but for something more. His parents encouraged his drive, even when they didn't fully understand his dreams. "You work so hard, son," his mother would say, kissing his forehead after a late night of homework. "One day, people will know your name." At 18, Jonathan earned a scholarship to study business at a prestigious university. He was the first in his family to attend college, and he carried the weight of their hopes with him. While others partied on weekends, he buried himself in books, internships, and business ideas. But even in college, Jonathan faced obstacles. Professors sometimes underestimated him. Peers questioned his place. "How'd you get in here?" one student once sneered, eyeing Jonathan's worn backpack and thrift store suit. Jonathan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Every insult, every slight only pushed him harder. In present day, Jonathan's fingers drummed lightly on the armrest as he stared out the window at the expanse of sky. Memories of his journey were always bittersweet. For every moment of triumph, there had been struggles, moments of loneliness, nights of doubt, years of relentless work. And even now, despite all he had achieved, there were still people like her, people who judged before they understood. His thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendant approached with a soft smile. "Mr. Reed, would you care for a drink or anything to eat?" "Just water for now, thank you," Jonathan replied politely. The attendant hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier. You handled it with so much grace. I don't think I could have been so composed." Jonathan looked up at her, his expression softening. Sometimes grace is the best response. People learn more from how you carry yourself than from what you say. She nodded, visibly moved. Well, it was inspiring to witness. As she left, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a message. It was from his assistant, Carl. "Carl, sir, the incident at the airport is going viral. Videos are all over social media. Should we issue a statement?" Jonathan sighed, his shoulders tensing briefly before he relaxed again. He hadn't asked for any of this attention, but in today's world, nothing stayed private for long. He typed back a simple reply. "Jonathan, no statement. Let it speak for itself." Setting the phone aside, Jonathan leaned back in his seat. He had always believed in leading by example, not by headlines. If the world chose to see the incident as a lesson, so be it. If not, he would keep walking his path, unshaken and unbothered. Meanwhile, in seat 23D, the blonde woman sat hunched, staring blankly at the tray table in front of her. The full weight of her actions pressed heavily on her chest. She could feel the judgmental eyes of other passengers, though none dared speak to her. The shame was unbearable, but what haunted her most was the quiet dignity with which Jonathan Reed had confronted her behavior. "He owns the airline." The words echoed in her mind like a taunt. She fumbled for her phone, opening the Notes app. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she typed out a message she didn't know if she would ever send. "Dear Mr. Reed, I owe you an apology." She deleted the words. What good is an apology after something like that? Instead, she sat there, staring into nothing, the hum of the engines offering no comfort. For Jonathan Reed, the flight was a continuation of his journey. But for her, it was the beginning of an uncomfortable reckoning. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, but for her, it was anything but peaceful. Sitting in seat 23D, Karen, whose real name, as printed on her boarding pass, was Karen Whitaker, shifted uncomfortably in her narrow seat. She gripped her small handbag, her mind replaying the events at the gate like a broken record. The quiet shame was worse than any shouting match could have been. Jonathan Reed, the man she had humiliated, had simply stood there, calm, collected, powerful. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown her words back at her. He hadn't needed to. The truth had stripped her bare in front of dozens of strangers. The whispers hadn't stopped since the flight began. Passengers in coach who'd caught wind of the incident likely from social media, were stealing sideways glances at her. 2 rows back, she overheard a teenager whispering to his friend. "Is that her? The woman from the video?" "Yeah, it's all over Twitter. Can you believe she tried to kick him off his own airline? What's wrong with people?" Karen felt her face heat as shame climbed up her neck like ivy. She sank lower in her seat, clutching the in-flight magazine, though she couldn't focus on the glossy pages. She'd heard about people like her. Karens. Entitled. Judgmental. Privileged. She'd never considered herself one. How could she? She was a mother of 2. She donated to charities. She volunteered at the church food drive. And yet, her actions earlier had betrayed something uglier lurking within her. Her mind wrestled with itself. What possessed me to act like that? Why did I single him out? The answer gnawed at her, unspoken and undeniable. You judged him. You saw his skin, his calm demeanor, and you decided he didn't belong. Karen's shoulders slumped. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the overwhelming guilt that pressed on her chest. Meanwhile, in first class, Jonathan Reed closed his laptop, his work momentarily forgotten. The earlier encounter had settled in the back of his mind, but a part of him wondered what would come of it. He knew the video was already spreading. His assistant Carl had sent updates about hashtags like Jonathan Reed and NAR Respect trending on Twitter. Thousands of people were commenting, arguing, debating. Jonathan's fingers traced the edge of his armrest as he stared out the window. He had no desire to engage in social media theatrics. At this stage in his life, actions spoke louder than words, and the people who truly mattered already understood his values. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Carl. Sir, CNN and BBC are running the story. Journalists are asking for comments. Jonathan sighed and typed back, Jonathan. No comment. Let them talk. As he returned the phone to his pocket, a flight attendant approached with a soft smile. Mr. Reed, would you like your dinner served now? Not yet, thank you, he replied kindly. She hesitated, clearly wanting to say something else. I hope you don't mind me saying this, she began carefully, but watching how you handled everything earlier, it was inspiring. Jonathan offered her a small smile. Thank you. Honestly, she added, not many people would have responded with that level of grace. Jonathan considered her words for a moment before replying. Grace is just another form of strength. People underestimate it. The attendant nodded, visibly moved, before retreating to continue her service. Jonathan leaned back, closing his eyes. He thought of his father, how growing up the man had taught him about dignity and restraint. Son, his father once said, kneeling in the garage with oil-stained hands, sometimes the best way to win a fight is to show them who you are without throwing a single punch. That lesson had stayed with him, guiding him through the boardrooms, the prejudice, the unexpected battles he faced on his rise to success. Hours later, Karen couldn't take it anymore. The tension inside her chest had become unbearable. She pulled her phone from her bag, her fingers shaking as she opened a blank email draft. She stared at the screen for several minutes. How do you apologize for something like this? Finally, she started typing. I don't know if you'll read this, but I hope you do. I owe you an apology. Not just for what happened at the gate, but for everything my words and actions represented. I don't know what came over me. I judged you unfairly, and worse, I acted on that judgment. I let my assumptions blind me to the truth. It was ugly, and I am deeply ashamed. Seeing how you handled the situation has stayed with me. You could have embarrassed me further or humiliated me, but instead, you chose grace. That grace taught me more about myself than I wanted to know. I can't take back what I did, but I can promise to learn from it. I will do better. Be better. Sincerely, Karen Whitaker. Karen hovered over the send button, her heart hammering. She read the email one last time, then pressed send. As the email disappeared into cyberspace, she released a shaky breath. It's a start, she thought. She didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't deserve it. But she hoped at the very least that Jonathan Reed would know how deeply she regretted her actions. For the first time since the flight began, she allowed herself to lean back in her seat and close her eyes. The shame was still there, but now it was joined by something else. Resolve. I will be better. Roll. Up in first class, Jonathan's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the notification, an email from an unfamiliar name. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it. As he read Karen's words, his expression softened. He didn't smile, but there was a quiet understanding in his eyes. He sat back in his seat, staring at the screen for a long moment. Then, he set the phone aside and closed his eyes. He didn't need to reply. Some lessons didn't require words. I'd see pros for Karen Whitaker. This flight marked the end of who she was, and the beginning of who she wanted to become. For Jonathan Reed, it was just another day, another moment to lead by example in a world that still had so much to learn. The flight moved steadily through the air, cruising above a sea of clouds, yet for Karen Whitaker, the calm outside the window felt disconnected from the storm raging inside her. She sat rigid in seat 23D, her mind drifting back to the email she had sent to Jonathan Reed. She wondered if he had even read it, if her words had made it past the chaos she had caused. The shame still clung to her, but with it was a determination she hadn't felt in years, a need to confront her own faults and stop hiding behind the comfortable bubble of privilege that she had unknowingly allowed to shape her worldview. She looked down at her hands, hands that had once pointed with entitlement and anger, and for the first time she questioned everything she had accepted as normal. As the engines hummed and passengers dozed, Karen felt a deep urge to do something, anything, to make this moment count for more than just her own guilt. Meanwhile, up in first class, Jonathan Reed remained an image of composure, though his thoughts swirled beneath his calm exterior. He had seen people like Karen his entire life, quick to judge, slow to listen. It was a familiar pain, one that had stung him since childhood, but today it hit differently. As he stared out at the endless horizon through the window, he thought about his father's quiet sacrifices, his mother's unshakable strength, and the lessons they had etched into his character. "You don't fight fire with fire, son," his father had once said. "You fight it with water, with patience, with dignity." Those words had kept Jonathan steady through countless storms, and today, here he was again, reminded that no matter how successful he became, he would still be forced to prove himself in a world where assumptions lingered. Yet, Jonathan didn't let anger claim him. Instead, he focused on the opportunity, the chance to inspire change through action. Jonathan glanced at his phone again, rereading Karen's email one last time. It was sincere, broken, but sincere. He could feel her regret in the carefully chosen words, and as much as his instinct had been to ignore it, something stopped him. Perhaps her message wasn't just for him. Perhaps it was a small step towards something larger. He leaned back, considering what to do. Just then, the flight attendant appeared beside him with a quiet smile. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, "we'll be starting the meal service now. Would you like to select your entree?" Jonathan nodded absent-mindedly, choosing without much thought, but as the flight attendant turned to leave, Jonathan stopped her. "Could you do me a favor?" he asked, his tone calm but purposeful. "Of course, sir," she replied. Jonathan handed her a handwritten note on his business card and said, "Would you mind delivering this to seat 23D?" She blinked, surprised, but nodded with a small smile. "Right away, Mr. Reed." Back in coach, Karen had managed to drift into a light, restless sleep when the flight attendant gently tapped her shoulder. Startled, she straightened quickly, fumbling for composure. "Yes?" she said, her voice unsure. The attendant handed her the note with a polite smile. "This is for you, ma'am." Karen took the card, confusion knitting her brow, and unfolded it. The neat, strong handwriting was unmistakable. "Karen, change doesn't happen overnight, but taking the first step matters. Keep walking forward. J. Reed." Karen read the note twice, her breath catching in her throat. She clutched the card as though it might disappear, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. In just a handful of words, Jonathan had done something she hadn't expected. He had extended grace to her once again. Where he had every right to ignore her, to condemn her for her earlier behavior, he had chosen kindness instead. The realization hit her like a weight to the chest. She had come onto this flight as one version of herself, a woman unaware of the biases that shaped her actions, and now she felt herself transforming, bit by bit, into something new. Karen knew it wasn't enough to feel sorry. Sorry was easy. Change was harder. She didn't know how, but she promised herself she would be better, more aware, more thoughtful, more open. The hours passed quietly. Meals were served and trays collected, the cabin lights dimming as passengers settled in for the long flight over the Atlantic. Jonathan spent the time reviewing reports, making notes for an upcoming board meeting, but every now and then he glanced down at his phone. The video of the airport incident had spread far and wide. News headlines dissected the story. CEO of Reed Airlines confronts discrimination with grace. Thousands of comments poured in, both supportive and critical. But Jonathan didn't focus on the noise. He wasn't here to win over the internet or become a viral sensation. If his actions had made one person reflect, one person like Karen, then that was enough for him. By the time the flight began its descent into New York, the cabin came alive with movement and chatter. Passengers stretched, gathered their belongings, and prepared for landing. Karen held Jonathan's note in her lap, reading it one last time before carefully tucking it into her bag. As the plane touched down, a wave of both relief and apprehension washed over her. She didn't know if she would ever see Jonathan Reed again, but she knew one thing. She owed him more than an apology. She owed him action. Jonathan, stepping off the plane as the first to disembark, barely noticed the cameras waiting at the gate. Reporters who had caught wind of the viral story. He smiled politely but kept walking, focused as always on the road ahead. Behind him, Karen walked through the jet bridge and into the terminal, her shoulders straighter, her steps purposeful. The world felt a little different now. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but for the first time in years, she was ready to face it. And somewhere deep in the back of her mind, she thought of Jonathan's quiet words. Change doesn't happen overnight, but taking the first step matters. For both of them, the flight was over. But the story had only just begun. The wheels of the plane met the runway with a gentle screech, and the familiar jolt signaled the arrival in New York. Jonathan Reed, calm and collected as ever, stepped off the jet bridge and into the bustling terminal. Flashes from cameras flickered in his peripheral vision as reporters scrambled to approach him, their voices rising in a cacophony of questions. He had expected this. News of the incident had spread faster than wildfire, and his name, once known only in business circles, was now trending globally. Yet Jonathan moved through the terminal with the same quiet grace he always carried, ignoring the noise as if it were nothing more than wind. "Mr. Reed, how did you stay so calm? Do you have a message for people who face discrimination like you did? Was this handled as a PR stunt?" Jonathan's assistant, Carl, waited just past the media chaos, phone in hand, his expression strained. "The press is relentless," Carl said, as he fell into step beside Jonathan. "They're practically camped out waiting for a statement. I can handle it if you want to skip the press conference altogether." Jonathan shook his head slightly. "Let them talk. I don't need to." Carl hesitated, nodding as he updated the calendar on his phone. Jonathan always made it clear he wasn't interested in media storms, only in creating meaningful change. That was the foundation of everything he had built. But see, meanwhile, further back in the terminal, Karen Whitaker stepped off the plane with the weight of the past hours still clinging to her. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with passengers who had seen everything unfold. The note from Jonathan Reed burned like a brand in her bag. She wasn't sure why she had kept it. Perhaps as a reminder. Perhaps as proof that she had been seen for more than her worst moment. Keep walking forward. The words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. At baggage claim, Karen watched as people recognized Jonathan Reed from afar, some applauding softly, others rushing for a selfie or to shake his hand. He remained gracious, offering small smiles and quiet thank yous before slipping into the back seat of a black SUV waiting at the curb. Karen didn't approach him. It wasn't her place. Instead, she lingered at a distance, watching him disappear into the New York traffic. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope, not just for herself, but for change. Hours later, Jonathan sat in his corner office at Reed Airline's New York headquarters. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow through the massive windows that overlooked the city. His desk, pristine as always, held only a few folders and his laptop, which buzzed with notifications. Carl stood nearby, scrolling through updates. "The video's been shared over 6 million times," Carl reported, looking both excited and concerned. It sparked a huge conversation. People are sharing their own stories of being unfairly judged. Some are calling it the Jonathan Reed lesson. He paused, hesitating. Of course, there's backlash too. Some people say you're milking the moment. Others, well, you know how the internet can be. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, hands folded thoughtfully in his lap. He didn't seem troubled. "Change always comes with resistance, Carl," he said quietly. "But the voices that matter are the ones who've learned something." Carl nodded. "What about the woman, Karen Whitaker? You want to issue a formal statement about her?" "No," Jonathan replied immediately. "She sent me her apology. That's enough." He looked out the window for a moment, his voice softer when he added, "People like Karen don't need a public shaming. What they need is a chance to be better." Carl watched him, admiration clear on his face. "You're a bigger man than most, sir." Jonathan smiled faintly. "I'm not a bigger man, Carl. I'm just doing what I wish others had done for me." Karen sat alone in her small Manhattan hotel room later that evening, her suitcase still half unpacked. The muted hum of the news played in the background as she scrolled through her phone. The video of her encounter with Jonathan Reed had now reached every corner of the internet. Her face, flushed, furious, and accusing, was plastered everywhere. The headlines stung. "Woman attempts to remove CEO from his own airline. When assumptions go too far." "The power of grace," Jonathan Reed's viral lesson in dignity. Her phone vibrated with messages from friends and family. Some offered support, others were less forgiving. "How could you?" one message read. "I thought you were better than that." Karen tossed the phone aside, burying her face in her hands. Shame was an insidious thing. It gnawed at her, whispering that she deserved this fallout, that no apology could wipe clean what she had done. But somewhere in the darkness of her thoughts, Jonathan's words returned to her. "Keep walking forward." That night, Karen opened her laptop and began to write. She poured her thoughts into a blog post, her confession, her apology, and her reflection. She wrote about her biases, her assumptions, and the moment she saw herself through Jonathan Reed's eyes. She didn't write to excuse herself. She wrote because she needed the world to know how wrong she had been and how determined she was to change. The post ended simply. "I owe Jonathan Reed more than an apology. I owe him the truth. We all do. Change begins when we face ourselves, and I'm facing myself now." When Karen hit publish, she didn't expect forgiveness, and she didn't expect praise. All she hoped for was that her story would serve as a mirror for others, the way Jonathan Reed had been a mirror for her. A week later, Jonathan sat in his office reviewing reports when Carl walked in, holding up his phone. "You'll want to see this." Jonathan took the phone, skimming the headline on the screen. "From shame to accountability, Karen Whitaker's public apology goes viral." Attached was her blog post, filled with raw honesty and vulnerability. Jonathan's brow lifted slightly as he read, but a small, approving smile touched his lips by the time he finished. "Looks like she took that first step," Carl said, watching Jonathan's reaction. Jonathan set the phone down and nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes." As he looked out at the city below, he thought once again of his father's words. Change didn't come easily. It didn't come loudly. It came quietly, in the moments when people dared to confront themselves. For Karen Whitaker, it was only the beginning. But for the world that watched, her story, their story, had become something bigger. A lesson, a reminder, a ripple that could spread farther than any of them knew. Jonathan leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief moment of reflection. He hadn't set out to change the world that day at Heathrow Airport, but maybe, just maybe, the world had begun to change anyway. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass walls of Jonathan Reed's corner office, illuminating the sleek modern space. The quiet hum of the city below acted as white noise as Jonathan stood near the window, gazing out at the skyline of New York. The city was alive, thriving, and relentless, a reflection of the world he navigated every day. His assistant Carl entered with his usual efficient energy, carrying a tablet. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," Carl began, his tone brisk but respectful. "There's an update on the situation with Karen Whitaker." Jonathan turned, raising an eyebrow slightly. "What about her?" Carl swiped on his screen, holding it out for Jonathan to see. After her blog post went viral, a diversity and inclusion organization reached out to her. Apparently, they've asked her to speak at an upcoming panel on bias and accountability. Jonathan took the tablet, reading the article carefully. The headline read, "Karen Whitaker to address public bias and her personal transformation." There was a photo of Karen, different from how she had looked at Heathrow. In this one, she seemed subdued, more reflective. The defiance and entitlement were gone, replaced by something softer. Her words from the interview struck Jonathan. "When you realize you've contributed to a problem, you can choose to run from it or work to fix it. I'm not perfect. I can't undo my mistakes, but I can listen, learn, and use my experience to help others see the truth about their assumptions." Jonathan handed the tablet back, his face impassive. Carl, unable to hold his curiosity, asked, "What do you think? Do you believe her?" Jonathan turned back to the window, his voice thoughtful. "People can change, Carl, but it's not my belief that matters. It's their actions. She's walking the path now. That's what counts." Carl nodded, though skepticism lingered in his expression. "Well, her story's everywhere. It's changed the conversation. People are talking about bias, how to confront it, how to own it. It's like that moment at Heathrow set off something bigger." Jonathan smiled faintly. "That's how change works. It starts small. One moment, one decision, one person brave enough to face the truth." Carl hesitated before adding, "They've invited you to the panel too, sir. It seems they want the man who showed grace to share his perspective alongside her." Jonathan turned to face him, considering the invitation. "Me?" he said, his tone amused. "The world doesn't need another CEO on a stage. Karen's voice will do more than mine ever could." "Maybe," Carl replied, "but I think people want to hear how you managed to stay so composed that day. They're calling it an example of grace under fire." Jonathan exhaled slowly, shaking his head with a small smile. "Grace isn't a performance. It's a choice." He walked back to his desk, his eyes skimming the paperwork laid out neatly before him. Let Karen speak. Let her story lead the way. If she stays true to her words, that'll be enough. Carl nodded, understanding Jonathan's position. Understood, sir. I'll let them know. 2 weeks later, in a packed conference room in Manhattan, Karen Whitaker stood nervously behind the podium, her palms clammy and her heart pounding in her chest. Rows of faces stared at her, many familiar from the online world. People who had followed her journey since the infamous Heathrow incident. The story had become bigger than she ever imagined, and now here she was, tasked with confronting her mistakes in front of a crowd. Jonathan wasn't in attendance, though she had secretly hoped he might be. She knew now that he didn't seek the spotlight. He never had. That, she realized, was part of what made his response to her so powerful. He hadn't humiliated her. He hadn't sought revenge. He had simply shown her who he was, leaving her to reckon with herself. Karen cleared her throat and began to speak. A month ago, I was someone who thought I knew who I was. I thought of myself as a good person, kind, considerate, fair. And yet I found myself standing in an airport, doing something so cruel, so blind, that I still struggled to recognize myself in that moment. The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of a chair or click of a camera. When I saw Jonathan Reed, when I judged him, I didn't see the truth. I didn't see a man who worked harder than I could ever imagine, a man who built something extraordinary. I saw only what my biases allowed me to see, and because of that, I spoke words I can't take back. But Mr. Reed, he showed me something that I didn't deserve. He showed me grace. Karen paused, her voice cracking slightly. That grace taught me more about myself than any lecture or book ever could. It taught me that change begins the moment you stop running from the truth. As she continued, Karen's voice steadied. She shared her journey of reflection, accountability, and the work she was now committed to doing, not just for herself, but for others like her, who had never stopped to question the assumptions they carried. When she finished, the audience erupted into applause, not for her redemption, but for the raw honesty she had shared. Later that evening, back in her hotel room, Karen received an email. Her breath caught when she saw the sender's name. Jonathan Reed. Subject: Keep walking forward. Karen, I saw the video of your speech. You spoke with courage, and that matters. Keep doing the work. Not for applause, but because it's right. Change takes time. But I believe you've taken the first step. Jonathan. Karen smiled softly as tears filled her eyes. She read the message twice before closing her laptop. Jonathan Reed didn't owe her anything. He had already given her more grace than she deserved. And yet, with his words, he had given her something she hadn't realized she needed: hope. For Karen, this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new path, one where she would confront her biases, challenge others to do the same, and strive every day to be better than she had been. And for Jonathan, far away in his quiet office, the news of Karen's transformation was a reminder that change, while slow and difficult, was possible. He didn't need to be on a stage. He didn't need the world's applause. It was enough to know that sometimes a single moment of grace could change everything. A brisk autumn wind blew through the streets of New York, sending leaves skittering across the pavement and rustling the coats of hurried pedestrians. In the heart of the city, the annual Reed Airlines Global Leadership Summit was taking place, bringing together industry leaders, business innovators, and aspiring entrepreneurs. The conference hall buzzed with activity, name tags flashing, hands shaking, ideas exchanged. At the center of it all was Jonathan Reed, a man whose name had become synonymous with quiet leadership, dignity, and vision. Jonathan stood at the back of the hall, watching the event unfold with a small sense of satisfaction. The summit was more than a corporate gathering. It was an opportunity to create meaningful change. Panels addressed diversity, leadership, and breaking barriers in industries where voices like his had once been excluded. It was a far cry from the days when he, as a young black entrepreneur, had been turned away from boardrooms before he even had the chance to speak. "Mr. Reed," Carl said as he approached, holding his tablet. "The final panel is starting, the one on accountability and transformation. Would you like to sit in?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Who's leading it?" Carl smiled knowingly. "Karen Whitaker. She accepted our invitation." Jonathan paused. It had been nearly a year since the incident at Heathrow Airport, a moment that had launched a viral conversation on bias, humility, and grace. Jonathan had seen Karen's growth from afar, the small steps she had taken to become a better version of herself. She hadn't just apologized. She had acted. She had spoken at schools, diversity forums, and corporate workshops. She'd shared her story not as a badge of redemption, but as a reminder of how bias could blind even the best intentions. "Let's see how she's doing," Jonathan said, tucking his hands into his pockets and walking toward the panel hall with Carl following close behind. The room was already full when they entered. Jonathan chose a seat near the back, his presence unnoticed in the dimly lit space. Karen Whitaker stood on the stage, poised and calm. She wore a simple navy blazer, her hair swept back, her expression composed. She didn't look like the woman who had once pointed an accusing finger at him. She looked like someone who had been broken open and rebuilt stronger. "Good afternoon, everyone," Karen began, her voice steady as she addressed the audience. "My name is Karen Whitaker, and I'm here today because of a mistake I made, a mistake that changed me." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. "Last year, I judged a man at an airport based solely on my assumptions. I didn't see him for who he was. I didn't ask questions. I didn't stop to think. I acted out of prejudice I didn't even realize I carried. And because of that, I embarrassed myself, hurt someone else, and revealed a part of myself I never wanted to see." Karen's gaze swept the room. Her words hung heavy in the air, unflinching and raw. "But in that moment, I was given something I didn't deserve: grace. Instead of meeting my ignorance with anger, Jonathan Reed met me with dignity. He didn't shout or humiliate me. He held up a mirror and allowed me to see myself clearly. It was a painful moment, but one I will forever be grateful for." Jonathan watched her, impressed by how her voice didn't waver. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Karen continued, echoing the very words Jonathan had once written to her. "It happens when we choose to take responsibility. It happens when we stop defending our mistakes and start learning from them. It happens when we realize that we are not defined by one moment, but by what we do after." The audience murmured quietly in agreement, some nodding, others furiously jotting notes. Karen smiled faintly, her voice softening. "I am not here to pretend that I've fixed everything. I'm still learning. I'm still walking forward, as Mr. Reed once told me to do. And I will continue to walk forward, because I know now that the work of change never truly ends." The room erupted into applause. Karen stepped back from the podium, her face calm but her eyes shining with emotion. Jonathan watched her for a long moment before he, too, clapped softly, his pride evident. An hour later, after the panel had ended and the crowd began dispersing, Karen found herself standing near the refreshments table, trying to calm her nerves. Though the speech had gone well, the weight of the past year was still fresh in her mind. She felt a presence nearby and turned to see Jonathan Reed standing there, a faint smile on his face. "Mr. Reed," she said, startled. "I didn't know you were here." Jonathan nodded. "I wanted to hear you speak." Karen searched his face for any sign of judgment, but found only kindness. "I hope I did justice to the moment you gave me." "You did," Jonathan replied. "You've come a long way." Karen swallowed hard, her voice sincere. "That's because of you. You had every right to embarrass me that day, but you didn't. You gave me grace when I deserved the opposite, and I've spent every day since trying to live up to that." Jonathan studied her for a moment before replying. "Karen, the truth is, we all carry biases. The difference is whether we let them control us or confront them. You confronted yours. That takes courage." Karen's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears back, offering him a small smile. "Thank you for everything." Jonathan returned the smile, extending his hand. "Keep walking forward." Karen shook his hand firmly. "I will." As Jonathan turned to leave, Karen watched him disappear into the crowd, a quiet giant who had changed her life with nothing more than dignity and a handful of words. She knew her journey was far from over, but for the first time, she believed in the possibility of real transformation, not just for herself, but for others who might hear her story. Jonathan stepped out into the crisp autumn air, taking in the skyline as he walked toward his waiting car. Carl stood by, already running through his evening schedule, but Jonathan barely heard him. He was thinking about Karen Whitaker, not as the woman who had once doubted him, but as someone who had proven that change was possible. "Mr. Reed?" Carl said, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Are you ready?" Jonathan looked up, his gaze steady. "I'm always ready." As the car pulled away, Jonathan leaned back in his seat, his father's words echoing softly in his mind. "Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to show them who you are without throwing a single punch." For Jonathan Reed, the fight had never been about revenge. It had always been about something greater, leaving the world just a little better than he had found it. And in that moment, as the city faded into the distance, he allowed himself to smile, knowing that grace had won.